Well, good morning. Thank you for being here on a rainy Friday morning after a very fun party. So it's great that you're all here. And it's lovely to have family here too, my sister. This is my first GLP meeting, and I've just had a wonderful time. This is great. I hope I do it proud. So I was very pleased to be able to have the chance to engage with this really interesting theme of what people want from land. And for me, that also means attending to the ideologies that animate those desires for land, the histories that have shaped them, and the normative notions about what relationships to land should be. And I'm going to engage with this theme through work that I do through the landscapes that I'm most familiar with, which are the land-abundant frontiers of Central America. Now, like any frontier, they offer an excellent context in which to think about this theme, because a frontier is, by definition, a landscape of desire on which those who are not yet even there inscribe their dreams for their own and the land's future. Is the volume okay? All good? Okay. I'll begin by reviewing some of the different types of people, actors, stakeholders, agents, whatever you want to call them, and their different desires for Central America's frontiers. These categories are super crude and they're not comprehensive, but I offer them here as a heuristic for thinking through this theme, where agents' abilities to realize their desires will be signaled by the conversion, or not, of frontier forest to pasture, as here. So I'll start with the indigenous societies who have lived in these spaces for millennia, and for whom, of course, frontier simply means menaced homeland. They have fought for a long time to defend their vision, which is to dwell in these places of deep cultural and spiritual significance on their own terms, managing land and resources under their own customary arrangements within a broader governance structure of territorial autonomy. This vision is often manifest as landscapes of relatively high biodiversity and agrodiversity compared with settler landscapes around them. Indigenous positions vis-a-vis the land are endorsed and championed by the transnational indigenous rights movement, and they also overlap, but can also conflict with, those of the global conservation community, which, informed by beliefs about the inherent value of wilderness, seek landscapes that maximize biodiversity and minimize human impacts, typically. And they've been active for decades in Central America's frontiers, instrumental in setting up a host of de jure protections from national parks to biosphere reserves. And their efforts are in turn supported by northern governments via aid packages that may combine conservation with rural development programs. In the 1990s, for example, the US government supported programs, support for conservation with development programs was part of peace-building efforts following the dirty wars of the 1980s. And then, of course, academic researchers like us are also stakeholders, too. For those of you who know Carl Zimmer, he's in that picture. Okay. Then there are the landless migrants, pushed to the frontier by profound land inequality elsewhere, and pulled by the deep-seated conviction that by transforming what to them are illegible no man's lands into discrete homesteads, they will achieve livelihood security, if not wealth. Many depend on the existence of squatting laws that can, in time, legitimize their presence in otherwise protected areas. But due to lack of other state support, many fail. Others are violently dispossessed by another group of actors, typically absentee cattle ranchers. This picture depicts the elites who fomented the 2009 Honduran coup. Historically powerful latifundistas, this group of people seeks to attract regional and international capital to programs in agribusiness, infrastructure, and extractive industries. And their visions for the land are shared and bankrolled by an international web of development banks, private equity firms, and agribusiness conglomerates, as you all know. There have been great talks on this theme, always seeking new avenues for investment expansion and portfolio diversification. And these visions often align with those of Central American governments, whose political leaders are, after all, deeply intertwined with the landholding elites. But the state here plays multiple and often contradictory roles, because in search of FDI, they can offer up frontiers for foreign investors on the one hand, but those desires may also conflict with the state's simultaneous acceptance of foreign aid that's conditioned on frontier forest protection. Okay, so there are different groups who want very different things from these lands, and this is, to all of us, a very familiar story. We know that land change is always the emergent outcome of the desires of a complex web of diverse actors, multi-sited, multi-scaled, that interact within a frequently conflict-ridden context that is saturated with uneven power relations. And we know that change trajectories are profoundly path-dependent, shaped by history. And up until the mid-2000s, give or take, the emergent outcome of these interactions for Central America's frontiers was net forest loss, but at a relatively steady and slow rate, and largely on the margins of robustly defended conservation and indigenous territories. After the mid-2000s, that pattern changed dramatically. I returned after several years away from eastern Honduras to conduct field work there in 2011. And I knew that there were new pressures on frontiers all across Central America since the financial crisis. I knew that there was global funding fueling oil palm expansion, which was accelerating, and China was actively investing in significant infrastructure development. But those phenomena really could not explain why once resilient socio-ecological systems, many in the very heart of protected areas and indigenous territories, were not just diminished, but devastated. Communities were scattered, forests were gone. Something had shifted in the balance between these frontier actors, in the ways that they interacted to manage land and in the outcomes of their land use. And other researchers working in similar areas in Central America were finding the same thing, and they were finding it across landscapes that had very different land tenure regimes. Yet we were all finding the same thing. Something was going on. And so we got together to try to figure out what that was. And this is the interdisciplinary group that's now working on this, and I'm glad that some of them are in this room. So even though I'm going to report on our collective work, you're going to see that most of the photos and examples are from Honduras, because that's where I've worked. All right, so this fundamental shift we discovered was due to the emergence of a new and powerful category of actor, the cocaine trafficker. I say emergence because the people who became greatly enriched by their involvement in cocaine trafficking, otherwise known as narcos, were often already in place, especially as settlers, large landowners, and the corrupted mayors, judges, state foresters, police, and military. And I say new because while Central America has long been enrolled in the cocaine supply chain since the late 1970s, it was only after the mid-2000s, due to successful counter-narcotic interventions elsewhere, that the majority of Colombian cocaine was rerouted through Central America. In 2000, for example, it's estimated that 51 metric tons of cocaine moved through Central America from Colombia, 51 metric tons in 2000. Today, as of last year, that number is 3,000 metric tons, as production has soared in Colombia. And US agencies' billion-dollar efforts to stop this flow have done little more than ensure that traffickers stay nimble, that their risk premiums and therefore their profits stay high, and that they continue to spread their activities into more and more remote lowland coasts and forests. And you can see here how the bulk of trafficking moved from the Eastern Caribbean to the Isthmus after about 2006. All right, and I say that these emergent narcos are powerful because of the staggering sums that they earn from moving all those metric tons north. In Honduras, they make about $2,000 per kilo, or last year, $250 million in Honduras alone, of which about 50% appears to be profit. And this was slightly more than the average foreign direct investment into Honduras between 2004 and 2018. And drug profits far exceed aid monies and any funding for counter-narcotic operations. All that money and the impunity and weapons that it buys means that in situ narcos have the resources to compel any land-esque outcome that they want. And one outcome has been to clear vast areas in and around their transshipment sites. Their activities, very distinct from business as usual forest loss drivers, as Dr. Beth Tellman has told us on Wednesday. Their activities stand out as so brazenly illegal, so well-financed, so contiguous, rapid, and spatially predictable that we were able to identify a narco signal in forest loss. And we found these statistics. And that a lot of their activities were concentrated, as we had observed, in the heart of indigenous territories and protected areas, where land cover change, by definition, means profound changes in land ownership. So in the process, indigenous and smallholder communities are dispossessed of their lands. Food production declines as farmers' labor is diverted to wage work for cash, clearing forests and planting pasture for traffickers. Indigenous leaders who speak up are threatened, killed, or paid off. And their ability to resist has been further weakened by the continued silence of former allies in the international conservation community. We can talk about that later. Nor are Central American governments enforcing any of the land's many protections because, of course, politicians, military, and police are systematically enriched by trafficking, as they are by the US response, which has been to shift aid from rural development to fund militarized securitization and counter-narcotics assistance. Okay, so I'm outlining here a scenario in which frontier change trajectories become overdetermined by one new category of actor, the narco-enriched. But why? What do narcos want from land? And as it turns out, a lot. First, by buying up land along trafficking routes, they secure that territory from rival traffickers. And a second motive is that acquiring land at the expense of indigenous people and peasants weakens the grounds for those groups' resistance. Third, the purchase of land and the labor to clear it is an excellent means to launder cash profits. Frontier economies are particularly amenable to money laundering because of the pre-existing prevalence of barter and cash-based exchange, so transactions are rarely traceable. But land laundering only works if you can get the money out again. And the way that this happens is that low-level traffickers act as land brokers for the well-connected, narco-enriched elites higher up the supply chain. For those on the ground, that completes the laundering cycle. But what do those higher-level narcos, who may not live anywhere near these frontiers, want with this land? Well, they've got several reasons to buy it up. One is that they too need to hide their overaccumulated illicit wealth, especially given recent crackdowns on laundering through banks and commercial real estate in urban areas. And what better place to do it than in frontiers where it's unclear who owns what, even though all ownership is by definition illegal, all private ownership. And in the process, they get in on the ground floor of a speculative land market, confident that the land values will increase as the land becomes more scarce. Confident, too, in the eventual legitimization of their land ownership because the conditions under which the lands were protected have been removed. Now, this may take years, but these are patient investors because they bear very little financial risk by waiting. They just have to pay a caretaker to move cattle around and maintain the fences, since most rural land is not taxed. In time, they may develop the land themselves, or they may sell it to legitimate agribusiness interests, mixing illicit financing with foreign and domestic funding of what are often cattle raising or beef operations, or in the case of Miguel Facuse, a known drug trafficker and political scion and oil palm tycoon, is what he did. And so the lands pried open by narcos are horizontally integrated into a rentier-dominated agrarian economy available for broader, legitimate investment. Now, you'll notice that nothing that narcos want from land, certainly in the moment of transformation and often for years afterwards, have anything to do with the land's agricultural productivity. And this is not just happening in Central America. Drug traffickers are catalyzing and accelerating socio-ecological change along the many routes through which cocaine is trafficked, and there are accounts of similar dynamics at work in the Amazon and in Western Africa. In fact, we should assume that similar dynamics are playing out under all of these arrows. This now infamously awful cartographic device, frequently used by those depicting illicit commodity flows. And I say they're awful not only because they suggest that scary goods from the global south are stabbing into the heart of the global north. Usually the arrows are red, at least here they're pink or white. But because they show that those commodity flows appear to simply be skipping over the spaces between production and consumption. But in fact, we know that there are an ever-proliferating number of transit hubs where the cocaine supply chain touches down, where it embeds, where profits are captured and fund land change both directly and through the capitalization of horizontally integrated activities from mining to coffee production. Okay, so I want to scale up to away from cocaine now and offer a couple of take-homes. And one is that we've got to pay more attention, I think, to people's desires for land in these overlooked transit lands, these remote spaces of flows through which a whole suite of high-value contraband, such as contraband cigarettes, illegal wildlife, you name it, are not produced or consumed, but simply smuggled through landscapes ripe for transformation into private spaces of laundering and speculation. And I think we need to think more about the regulatory regimes that determine what is legal, where, and when. Second, I think we should not be surprised by, but rather expect that some type of so-called criminal actor is going to be latent, if not always operating in the world's frontiers. Because this type of actor, as already in Central America, there are kind of folk heroes that are sung about in narco corridos. This type of actor has been around and celebrated since the 17th century. According to historians of capitalism, narcos are just the latest in a long history of brigands, pirates, and buccaneers who, from the social margins and through the use of violence and coercive trade relations, could marketize and monetize lands and peoples formerly outside of the orbit of capital and private property rights. These actors could do what states could not, either due to expense or due to the threat to state legitimacy. For emerging European states, the usefulness of these liminal actors rested in part on their ability to be embraced or repudiated depending on political economic expediency. And those dynamics are little changed today. And this gets to my third point, which is, and last point, that just because these dynamics are centuries old does not mean that they are inevitable or that we should accept them. Because we have to ask what we as researchers also want from the landscapes that we know and often love. And I think all of us are in favor of building a world that meets the needs of the people who live on and from the land, rather than the needs of absentee land speculators. In our case, we want to tip the balance in Central America back in favor of long-term forest residents, at the very least to slow down the processes that are transforming their worlds, buy them time to respond. But how? How do we go from science into action? Well, I want to share with you now what we've done and how we've stumbled and what we're learning. So we began by kind of deciding to kick up, not to blame Central Americans as though there's something pathological going on down there, but rather to intervene in the realm that produces drug traffickers as insanely wealthy and chronically mobile. That is, their conditions of production. And we quickly determined that was our own country's, i.e. the US's, congenitally flawed drug policies, premised as they are on prohibition and interdiction. Now, this is a policy realm. The drug policy realm is seemingly completely unrelated to land, certainly not in areas of trafficking. So all we had to do, we thought, was to make the connection, as we did in this piece, between drug policies and environmental devastation, tailoring our argument, which we did, to the powerful conservation groups within the Beltway in Washington, D.C., who had worked so hard to save the forests in Central America. And so we thought would take up the mantle of drug policy reform once we just explained that that's what was undoing all their hard work. That did not happen. The conservation community, for various reasons, has not wanted to engage this issue. We can talk about that later. What did happen was a lot of things we didn't anticipate. One was that we got a lot of media attention globally. And indigenous organizations in Central America told us that this coverage gave them the cover to talk in a generic way about the processes that were affecting them without bringing violence upon themselves, and allowed them to better articulate how the drug war undermines their territorial struggles and articulate a position in regard to that. Our work also drew the attention of the Open Society Foundation's Global Drug Policy Program, and they funded our early modeling efforts. And this may be the only time that George Soros has funded land use change science, I don't know, but it's his money that is the Open Society Foundation. All right, so speculative capital comes full circle, just saying. All right. And through those connections, we shared our work in drug policy reform circles at the UN and elsewhere, made our case in op-eds and white papers, and met with groups on all sides of the issue. And I must say that the idea that scholars are neutral and wise was the impression that everyone, everywhere that I've talked with about this issue believed, which I found odd because I said all the things I'm saying to you now, and yet they thought that that was a very objective interpretation. Anyway, I found that very interesting. All right. But that process, doing all this stuff proved, I mean, it was fascinating, but it was also exhausting. And for various reasons, we got almost zero policy traction from doing it this way. And we've since learned that the best way to translate science into the policy arena is not to directly attempt it ourselves, but instead to work closely with allies in civil society who are hungry for scientific evidence and are seasoned experts in shepherding science into policy realms at times and in spaces that are most effective and not those that fit best the academic calendar. So for us, that has been the Drug Policy Alliance in the United States. But we still faced another problem. Even with those groups most sympathetic to our message, which was that drug interdiction, as usual, had to end, we got the inevitable question, but you can't be saying that we just lie down and let traffickers flood our streets with cheap cocaine. And honestly, we did not know how to respond. We had a great critique, but we fell short of articulating possible futures, imagining future worlds for Central America or anywhere if drug policies were to change in the specific ways that we were recommending. And that realization has inspired our latest phase of research, which began with building the agent-based model that Dr. Nick Magliocca presented on Wednesday, which robustly creates the dance between traffickers and interdiction forces and gives us a virtual world in which to test out the spatial, economic, and organizational responses of traffickers to different interdiction scenarios, including the heretical one where the US military and law enforcement stand down from their drug interdiction mission, We can test that and any other apparently unthinkable, counterintuitive, or seemingly impossible scenarios, and we plan to link those to likely outcomes for Central America's rural societies and forests. Will this work change anything? We can't know until we try. And so I'm going to leave you with some words from Rebecca Solnit, but the final take home here is that to champion the sort of world we want, where landscapes are managed in ways that are safe and just, we need to take the policy openings where we find them, with support from allies we might not yet know even exist, which may take us outside of our most familiar orbits. And we have to be willing to run scenarios of bold change, which I think many of you are already doing. We don't know in advance if our work will make a difference, but the mistake, I think, is to not try. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kendra. Great talk. I'm sure there are a few questions looming, so if you just raise your hand, I can take 2 questions. Yep, please.
This is probably beyond your work.
Can you?
We supposedly have an immigration crisis in the U.S. with people from the exact same countries that you're talking back, coming in caravans,
Yep.
the flood our borders. How does your work relate to this crisis?
It's no coincidence. So U.S. Militarization in the name of the drug war has been, that aid money has been captured by police and military in the Northern Triangle countries, and they use it to make life very difficult for the urban poor and the rural poor in the name of pushing a kind of elite economic agenda in these countries. And they use drug gangs to kind of help control rural populations and make life terrible for people living in those countries, who then consider that walking to the US border and being treated like animals at the US border is preferable to living in Tegucigalpa or Guatemala City or San Pedro Sula, which frankly it is. So there you go.
One more question. Yes.
Kendra, could you say some comments in terms of methodologies, particularly of working with highly dangerous or criminal individuals? Does a move towards more agent-based modeling, towards remote sensing, keep you from having to interview these people and interact and threaten them and be threatened by them?
Thanks for that, Christian. I think one of the things that is probably not surprising to people who work in these landscapes, especially if you've been working there for a long time, is that everybody knows what's going on. Everybody's willing to talk about it. It's no, I mean, you know, with the right people. Of course not. No, but it's not, nothing I'm saying here is unknown. It's just a question of who can speak about it. And what we were repeatedly told is, please speak about this because, you know, you're up there in Gringolandia and you can. We can't. So it wasn't a question of, you know, and many of these scary narcos are in fact people we've known forever who used to, you know, be cacao farmers. And so it's much less dangerous than it seems. And don't let that dissuade you from studying it, because honestly, it's, I think Heidi talked about this. These activities are so quotidian, people are willing to talk about them all the time, anytime.